Hi, I'm J.E. Prazzi, and this is Exploratory Fiction. I am the writer of the Malfunction Trilogy, the Raven Tree Society, and the acquisitions editor for Phoenix Fiction Writers. We are here today. I'm here with Bethany Wangler, and E.B. Dawson, and we're going to be talking about the Lord of the Rings. This is our second time recording on this subject. If you go back and look last week, we discussed Lord of the Rings before from a reader perspective. So this time we are talking about it from a writer perspective as authors. So this is going to be a spoiler-filled discussion. If you somehow missed out on Lord of the Rings before now, you might want to leave. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves? Bethany?
Sure, I'm Beth Wangler, or Bethany, since there are two Beths here. I'm the author of the Firstborn's Legacy saga, the short story The Word Thrower, and the Weaver's Blessing. And I'm also the art director for Phoenix Fiction Writers.
And I'm E.B. Dawson, also Beth, and I'm the editor-in-chief at the Phoenix Fiction Writers. I'm the author of the Creation of Jack series, the Lost Empire series, and the short stories Government Man, Nomad of the Emirates, and Striker.
And many more. Yes. Yep. So let's go ahead and jump into discussion. So the first kind of question is, how has Lord of the Rings impacted you as a writer?
I think we talked about this a bit last time as readers, just the impact it's had and the depth it's had. And we talked a lot about the themes, the emotional themes of how it's impacted us emotionally. I think there are millions of people who would say that over decades, and to see that kind of impact and resonance, it's something that I strive for as an author in my own work.
Yeah, I think that the depth has really affected me too. And just seeing how much time Tolkien spent on crafting his world and getting to know his characters has really encouraged me not to rush through my writing, but to take my time, because that's where the real depth, I'm trying to think of another word to use, but the richness to the world and the story comes in there. On a surface level, for me, this was my second that I was introduced to fantasy really late in life. So I read the Chronicles of Narnia when I was a junior in high school, and then was introduced to the Lord of the Rings movies when I was a senior. So that was the first time I ever knew fantasy existed, and all of a sudden I had a new idea for a story that it was the first story I'd ever finished writing, and it's now the series I'm working on currently. So it opened up a whole world as a writer for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, similar to Bethany, Lord of the Rings, not necessarily that I was introduced to fantasy late in life. My mom used to read to us when we were kids, and there was a lot of fantasy books. And while we read, including Narnia and Enid Blyton and all those fun childhood stories, but Lord of the Rings is kind of what kicked off my I am a writer phase in life. I wrote actually completed a few books as a teenager, but never really went too far into looking into publishing them. I just kind of scanned through and they're like, oh, you need an agent. And I'm like, I'm not doing that. So later in life, when I started writing, the first thing I wrote was a fantasy that had come to my mind when I first watched Lord of the Rings. So, like many fantasy writers, it was Lord of the Rings birthed a new idea for a new story, for a new book. And that hasn't been published yet. And I possibly am looking at maybe starting again in next year, starting editing and whatnot. But I think Lord of the Rings, on top of having multiple impacts on my craft and my voice and my intentions while writing, I can really say Lord of the Rings is the reason today why I'm a published writer. I don't think I would be in this place if it wasn't for Lord of the Rings.
Yay, that's awesome. I think specifically, I had already written or started writing when I was reading them. But I remember reading something in the introduction of Fellowship about how Tolkien wrote the way he wrote it in drafts. Like he first draft when he only got so far and he started completely over and completely rewrote and then got only so far and then finally got to the end the third time or something like that. I don't know the specifics of it, but it really encouraged me, just that aspect of it, because I was in a place where I would start a story and run with it for a while and then just be like, I have nowhere else to go. And sometimes I went back to the beginning and started again, or I started a new project. And I think for me, it was just that encouragement of like, you know, it's okay to not get it right the first time, and you can, like, even something that epic, you know, I think it opened my mind to having, you can write a book in different ways, and that encouraged me as an author to keep going. So
yeah, I think I also loved how in his story, though it was all made up, there was so much history to it, and I've always loved history. Like, growing up, I pretty much only read historical fiction, and I loved the subject of history. So the stories that I wrote were all historical fiction. But I think I just loved that there was this extra layer of creativity and imagination, and that I could make anything happen that I wanted to. So seeing how he was able to build such a rich world of history that really affected the everyday lives of the characters in many, many ways. I think that helped draw me to writing this genre, and it really influences the way I approach my series.
Yeah. And to kind of go in depth a little bit more, are there any aspects of your writing that you would say in particular come out of Lord of the Rings and out of Tolkien's writing, like specific things?
I wrote down a few because I was thinking about that for a while, because I don't think my style, I don't think anyone would really say my style is similar to, or even, I don't even write epic fantasy real. So like that doesn't, but I was thinking about, because I'm like, I'm sure there are. And just things I think that planted in my mind of like, oh, I could do these things. I do like large cast of characters. And I think because of how Tolkien does it and how, like, even the minor characters are important, and they have this very realness to them, even if they're only in there for a few chapters. There's the depth there, and I enjoy including people in, like, so it's not just the main characters. I like, he had a penchant for character speeches, and I think sometimes in my own writing, I think if it's at the right time, I do tend to like a good character speech too, and sometimes I have to, in revision, look at it and be like, no, it can't stay. But sometimes it works, and I think you have to adapt it, obviously, to a more modern style. I think the multiple read aspect of it, which I talked about a little bit earlier, it inspired me, especially the more I read it. You, like I said, you find more depth, and it becomes more real, and you draw out things, and it kind of ages with you. Like as I've gotten older, I've understood it better, and that has always been a huge priority for me as an author, is to write books that aren't just you read it once and then the second time it's not as good, you know, like there's stuff, and it affects how I write and how I think about my scenes, because I want that to exist there. And I think there's two more. One was again about characters, how he wrote characters that were noble and brave and strong. And I think as a reader, I recognize, like, these people are nobler and braver and stronger than I am, and I want to aspire to that. And I think as a writer, not being afraid to write those people who it's like, I'm not at a place in my life where I would make that choice, but I'm going to have this character do it because I want to be that person. I think sometimes in other fiction, a lot of modern fiction, there's a tendency to not write those characters as much, I guess I would say. And I like those characters. And then he has this, and you can see, obviously his books are super long, and that's one of the complaints against them, I think, from a lot of people. That it's not action, and the action doesn't drive through. It's a journey, and he's not afraid to break the tension of with little moments. And an example of that is, and some of these stood out. Well, a lot of them stood out because I saw the movies first, then I read the books, and you're like, oh wow, there's whole scenes in between that they just cut right out of the movie because they wanted to keep the action moving, which is fine. Movie format does better for that. But there's after Frodo gets stabbed by the sword and they're on their way to Rivendell, like it's a much longer journey in the book than in the movie. In the movie, it's like, and then Arwen takes him on the horse, and it's like a chase. But in the book, it's much more drawn out. But there's moments in there, and so it's not as like tension driven. But there's moments in there that I are really precious. And one of them is when Sam. It's just, I don't know. I always like this moment, but Sam comes up with this poem on the spot, and like nobody knew like he had that. And it's just a really cute moment in the book because he's pretending that he was reciting it from memory, but he wrote it himself, and it's about the trolls, I think.
Yes.
And I always really like that moment, and it's like technically, you know, they cut it from the movie because they wanted to drive the story forward, which is fine. But I love how Tolkien, in the middle of all, yeah, you know, the stakes are high, and we know this, and Frodo is in deep peril. There's just these moments like that are sweet, and that are like they build the characters out, and they drive the story forward, I think, in a different way. And I really appreciate that about I see myself doing that in my own writing sometimes, where I break the tension so it's not necessarily I don't know if there's a more technical word for that, but anyway, it's just a different approach, I think, to the story, and I think a lot of more modern stories. There's definitely that tilt towards, you know, keeping it fast paced, I guess. I don't know if any of that made sense, but
yeah, no, totally. I feel like modern stories, they don't expect the reader to meet you halfway. You have to go like 90% and let the reader have it really easy, which I think is good in some aspects. But in other aspects, you know, we need to be able to trust the reader more. Just because they enjoy movies and stuff doesn't mean they need to be spoon-fed everything.
Yes, because I think when you're as the reader, and that I did think about that earlier, how Tolkien expects his readers to be smart and intelligent and to like work for it. And when as a reader you do kind of come and meet the author there and put the work into it and to understanding, you almost can take more ownership of the story, and you feel like you're on the journey more together. And that's something I see huge in Tolkien's fiction, is that I'm not passive, just letting it fall right into my lap. I do put forth effort to read this story, and it takes longer, but then I feel like there's more ownership there, and I value that. I value that as an author too. I like to try to incorporate that into my fiction.
Yeah.
I think that when our readers are able to engage more with the story when we like expect them to, then that's when it really has a lasting impact on the reader. Pointing to myself here as a reader of Tolkien, and how, like you're saying, that act of having to really go and invest in the story really has made it have a more lasting impact on us. I liked what you were talking about with the noble characters, Beth, in Tolkien's. I think for me, it kind of has the opposite effect. I have a tendency more to write really good, pure, innocent characters. And so I love that there are so many of those characters in Lord of the Rings, but that they also are flawed. And they're still deeply human, even though they are admirable and praiseworthy. And I think that has been something I've really been challenged in recently, is writing characters who are good and pure and seeking the good of others, but also are flawed and human and not perfect, because nobody can relate to a perfect character. I also like what you mentioned. I hadn't thought about how he has such a large cast of characters, but I definitely see that in my own writing too. Even in my short stories, I'm constantly having to reel back and say, no, you don't need to have all these 15 side characters.
I know.
So I see that. I feel like it helps make the world feel more lived in, because we do interact with so many people in our day-to-day lives. And like I mentioned before, I think his like sprawling and in-depth history has really affected the way I've built my world. And there's a lot of things that I have given little, like put in little hints of things from the past, or that I've left room open to develop that more in future books because I know more of the history. So I just think it's made it so that the characters have, the story just isn't starting when the characters start on the page. There's more behind them. They're part of a larger world and a larger story. Just on a really superficial level, in the Silmarillion, I really loved the beginning when you have, oh, I should have looked up the names, but when you have the god character like singing a song, and that's how like creation is born. And so that is also how it happens in my series. I don't know if I've actually mentioned that in canon yet, but I love that imagery.
Yes, yes, I love that scene. That's a really powerful, especially knowing that Tolkien was kind of coming at it, not wanting it to be taken as as an allegory, but still he just applied that richness of his Catholic faith in there. I think that's really powerful. Yeah. I think I'm kind of coming from the opposite from you two, because both of you guys like your slower paced stories with kind of good characters, and I tend to have really fast paced stories with kind of nasty characters who are likable because I'm taking a viewpoint and allowing you to see what's going on inside their head and showing you the sympathetic parts. But my characters are horrible people. And most people who've read my books can attest to these. They're either start out as horrible people, or in the case of poor Bass, kind of go downhill. I think for me that's because I unlike you guys, both of your books, the theme is more heavily stated and a little bit more obvious, and my themes are very subliminal, and you kind of have to work hard for them. So I want everything else in the book to be really easy to digest and smooth going, so that you can get down to the questions, and that's what sticks in your head. And so, different style of writing there. How you guys took that from Tolkien, I kind of went the opposite direction. But I still find a lot in my work that is like directly from Tolkien. So I know we talked about Bethany, you said on a more superficial level. I definitely have one of those. The Wreckers from the Malfunction trilogy have a lot in common in my head with Balrogs. I just love that imagery. So I definitely kind of took a lot from that, especially for the movies. They have a skull-like face and kind of the dark fur, and the movement of them, but also just the idea of these demonic creatures who are, you have to be really terrified when you come across them. And I think it's less shown in Lord of the Rings than it is in the Silmarillion. When you read the Silmarillion, the Balrogs are really like, you get a feeling for how impressive they are. But yeah, I definitely kind of ripped that off, and I pulled some other things in there as well. I think some of the other things that I really pulled out, Tolkien gives a backstory to everyone. Every like little minor character has a backstory if you dig far enough. And this is both in the Silmarillion and in The Hobbit and in Lord of the Rings. And a lot of it is really subtle, but it's there. Like, you can get the backstory of like Thorin just from all these little tidbits about, where his grandfather was and where his father was. And you can get the backstory of, Balin, some of the stuff in. And I think that in my books, when I write my characters, I really strive to bring that out. So all of my characters have a backstory and have a kind of feeding into why they are the way they are, whether it's, my bad guys or my good guys or just random side characters. So, just like Sam has this in-depth character, I try to apply that equally to my friend character, who is Cowell, and lo and behold, he became a main character. But I think that was something really important from Tolkien that I really wanted to apply to my books, is that there was so much depth and history, not just to his world, but to all of his characters as well.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because we all write very differently.
Yeah.
but it's so interesting to trace back how you can take so much, even if you're not writing the same genre, take so much from from Tolkien and his books.
Yeah. So, do you guys believe there's such thing as writing rules? And if you do, how do you think Lord of the Rings either keeps these writing rules or breaks these writing rules?
They're more like guidelines.
Everybody quotes Barbosa on this.
It was such an interesting topic. I'm very much with Bethany on that too, though. But because even the technical rules of English change and evolve over time, like as society, and we see that. And I was talking about that earlier today with a friend. But I think there are best practices, and I think a lot of them are really valid because they exist to help you tell the story in the best way possible, in a way that readers can digest it. So they're definitely best practices. I do think those kind of change over time too, because I think as language changes, the way we think changes. So that's why people have a hard time with classics now, because we're not used to thinking that way. But and I think the contemporaries, were able to digest that kind of language in an easier manner. So I think those things change. There has to be flexibility there, but it's good to learn, obviously, the best practices, so that you can execute them or know when you want to break them. I do think there are a number of ways, and I don't know, and I did not research on what at Tolkien's time, I don't know if Jill knows what necessarily all the rules were, but from a more modern perspective, there's a lot of rules that Lord of the Rings, I would say, broke, which, including the huge cast of characters, and sometimes even it's impossible to know all the names of them. That's why there's all those like appendices and stuff like that. Including, I think, the long chunks of dialogue and speeches. Most people would say that's not the best way to, keep your reader engaged. And then another one I wrote was telling about events afterward. So it's really interesting. The one I can think of is Legolas in the third book. He tells about when they go on the paths of the dead with Aragorn. He tells about it. You don't actually see it play out. You only learn about it when he tells it to, I think, Merry and Pippin afterwards, which is most advice would say, no, you shouldn't do that. Like, your characters need to watch it happen. And I think it's hard to say, if he was wrong or right in what he chose, because it's like, it is what it is now, and we love it so much, and it works. But I think that's the point to it. He was confident, I think, in what his vision was. And I think that some of that uniqueness to how the story is told, I think that it sets it apart, and it kind of gives it its own character. And I think, obviously, he did it very, very well. So I think even if he broke the rules and stuff, it's not, I think he did very well. So yeah, that's my two.
Yeah, I agree with what Beth said about it's important to know the best practices for writing and the principles that do dictate good writing at your time, so that you know what that looks like, and then so that you can be really intentional if and when you do break them. I think a lot of problems come when we don't know what the best practices are and we break them unintentionally, and that is not a sign of good writing. But learning the rules, and then breaking them as needed is perfectly acceptable. I'm having a hard time thinking of rules that Tolkien broke. I should have thought about this more beforehand. Other than what Beth already mentioned. Yeah, I think nowadays we would say don't have such a long ending to your story, and don't have more diversity in your characters. But I think that the ending works really well for his story because you spent so long with the characters and you want to see how it really affects his world and how their triumph wasn't 100% triumphant. And I think knowing his personal story and background, that the characters that he does have really reflect that. So it makes sense from knowing who Tolkien is that that's why he wrote mostly male characters. I think we talked about that some in the last video.
Yes, yes, definitely. And anyone who's watching who wants to hear a little bit more about that, you should definitely check out that we talked about, especially that ending at length. Yeah, I think I'm definitely in the same camp with you guys where it comes to writing roles. I went from writing the first book with that I wrote as a serious author without even looking up things like how to write a chapter or how many words you should have in a fantasy story or how to write a good character, to consuming like so much on writing tips and best writing practices, that I kind of got overboard for a little while with the writing rules, especially when it came to POV. And definitely some of my critique partners can understand that the first few books I critiqued for people were like POV, POV, POV. And I've definitely changed on that a lot, I think, which is funny because one of my biggest things is interiority and having a glimpse into the character's minds, and Lord of the Rings has like none of that.
Yeah.
We get the random POV of like a fox running by, but we're not going to get any of Aragorn's deepest thoughts in the middle of a battle. Like, forget that.
Yep.
So I think, yeah, there's definitely, and I'm going to reiterate what Beth said there, that things change with time. I remember one person on Twitter ranting about how every writing rule these days is to cut words. And so we go from, cut the word that, and if people stand, they don't stand up, so cut the word up, or like all these little things like that where they're just like cut words, make it as short and concise as possible. And they're like, I have words in my novel, what am I going to do? I'm a horrible author. And Tolkien definitely doesn't concern himself with that at all. There's a lot of words in his novel, and probably a lot of words that these days we'd be like, hey, you need to cut that. But yeah, I think I definitely agree with you, Bethany, when you're talking about, it's good to know what works best these days so that you can make a conscious choice. I think the biggest difference for me when reading a book by amateur that breaks these rules versus a book by a professional, like Beth in particular, breaks a lot of writing rules, but she does it in a way that yes, she's not doing anything unintentionally. So it still makes it a really interesting read because you're getting a different kind of writing than you would typically get if walk into a bookstore and pull a YA book off the shelf. It's a very different book, but it's a very good book because she's doing it intentionally and she knows what she's doing, versus picking up a book by someone who's never written anything before and doesn't understand the rules. I can usually tell pretty quick. We start off with a dream sequence and the character stops to admire themselves in the mirror and explain exactly what they look like, and so yeah, I think there's definitely rules that should apply to every book these days, but I think in the end what matters is that you have a good story, and the story is what's going to stay with you even if the writing rules change.
Yeah, exactly. I think the goal is to communicate your story, and I think you need to think about who your audience is. So it's like, if you want to tell a crazy story in a crazy way, that's fine, but there may only be about 50 people in the world who will actually understand it. And if you're okay with that, then okay, that's great. Like, honestly, I don't have a problem with that. But if you do want to, if you're an author building your business, you want a wide audience, it's important. This is a huge lesson that I learned early on. It's important to communicate in the story in a way they can best understand. And there's things that stumble readers, and there's things that confuse readers, and there's ways to eliminate a lot of that. And a lot of that you find in the best practices. They don't always communicate it that way. Like, these rules exist so that but that's the heart of it. A lot of the rules, they exist so that your reader can digest the story, as smoothly, and understand what you're trying to say. So
Yeah. And I think there's a particular, sorry, Bethany, do you have something you want to say first?
I was just agreeing.
I think there's a particular need for this in the indie community, because, like any industry, when we started out, there's slim pickings. So you could pick up only a limited amount of books, and especially for 99 cents for free. Nowadays there's just so many books on Amazon that if you're competing just by how many books you're putting out a month, now is the time where that's starting to change. And I think for us as indies, I know everybody in PFW for sure, and most of the authors that I am connected with, we care about putting out a quality story first. We want to compete on quality. And so we have to take a very different approach from the early days of the indies that has set this kind of negative stereotype of, all indie books being just really poor quality with flat characters and bad editing and horrible covers and all those things. So I think that's an especially important thing for indie authors these days, is to at least understand the rules and put in the effort and research.
Yeah, that's true. As a teacher, I get to choose a lot of what books my students read, and I have had them read some indie books, but they're like when I choose that, I know which ones my students will enjoy based on which ones have followed the principles of writing best, so that my students can actually understand what they're saying and like enjoy the story as they're going through it. And I think that, yeah, what you guys have been saying is really true. We as authors, our goal is to communicate a story to readers who have certain expectations for the way that stories work. And we're operating in our given time with the ways that the brains and the language of the people around us works. So because we are in an age of tweets and movies and TV shows where things are really fast paced, like our writing usually reflects that. You usually don't have sentences that drag on for an entire page, because that's really hard for our readers to understand, even if we could technically do that because of our language capabilities. It's just not an effective way of communicating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So kind of in final thoughts, how is Lord of the Rings unique still? I know during its day it was kind of the first fantasy. It was unique in multiple ways in its own rights, but in these days, so many books have kind of copied Lord of the Rings and taken from that, that I think a lot of people would feel like that brand of fantasy is played out. So I'm wondering what you guys think makes Lord of the Rings still stand out, that it's still so beloved these days.
I think some things we already touched on. Tolkien was so committed to his vision and like put in the work, for the history, for the mythology, for the world building, that it shows. And also, but he committed to the vision he had with the length of it, with the prose he used, with the characters. And I think he poured his heart into it, and you can see it. I think that comes through a lot when an author is authentic in what they're writing. And I think it will always be unique to him, because I don't think someone else could write that story or turn out very differently.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's that unique flavor to it first, because it's a part of who he is, and the years I'm sure he spent on it and everything in there. But also, I mean, he was a very smart man, and he knew what he was talking about when it came to language and culture and stuff like that, and he used that professionally. And so I think he used all of those elements to his advantage. I think that's the exciting thing about writing. It's like you can have similar plots and characters, but when people approach it from their own perspective, it becomes something completely fresh. And that's why you can see the same type of stories over and over and over again, and some are better than others, but there's always something unique to it, especially when an author pours their heart and soul into it. Then it becomes a really unique twist and perspective on things like that. So.
Yeah, I agree. When a story really captures an author's heart, that is something that usually is pretty lasting for readers. I think also Tolkien's themes are still relevant, and that he wrote about humans, and humans, even though we have our like outward trappings with all technology has changed a lot in the past couple decades, humans are still basically the same, and we still wrestle with the same struggles. We still have the same doubts and fears, and so that those themes are true whether you're living in Middle Earth or living in the early 1900s or living in the early 2000s. So I think as authors, we should, like, part of our role is to really get to know and understand people, and that when we can really carry those, like, our understanding of people into our stories, that's what's going to connect with readers, and that's what's going to be lasting.
Yeah, I totally agree with both of you guys. I think kind of the main theme that I see coming through is that quality is what is important at the end of the day. I feel like a lot of new authors in particular are so obsessed with writing something that's relevant or writing something that's new and fresh, finding that idea that no one else has had and being scared that someone's going to steal that idea from them, that they forget that the quality with which they're writing and the quality with which they care about their reader and their characters and their themes, that's what's important at the end of the day, and that's what's going to create something that's going to last. Because if you hit on that perfect new idea, it's only going to be new until someone else writes the same thing in a slightly different way. You can't copyright an idea. Any final thoughts?
I just love how, he puts much dedication into his craft, and it really is, it's not just a bare bones story, it's a work of art, in itself, the language he used. And it's like we've talked about how he created whole languages for it. He created, it's the hard work he put into it, and how he combined multiple disciplines and what he loved in it. Again, like you said, it creates that quality, but it also, it's like whether or not you relate to it, I think you have to respect it and respect the achievement and the dedication he put into it. But you should relate to it because it's wonderful. No, I mean, it's,
Yeah. I don't think we've talked about this yet, but there was a lot of critique that went into his work, and he got a lot of feedback from other authors and from just readers. It really shows in the excellence of his work. So it can be really, like, I can have a lot of fear when I'm sharing my work with somebody else and telling them, hey, let me know everything that's wrong. But that is how we do get that excellence that you guys have been talking about. That's how we do improve in our craft and make sure that we're really communicating things that our readers will connect with and understand in the most effective way. So I think for us as authors, being willing to seek out and receive critique is really important.
Yeah, and I think all three of us in this chat right now have critiqued for each other at some point in some small way. The input of my critique partners is the most essential thing for my writing. I think that it's part of the process that I love the most, as much as it is terrifying, because up until that point, it's all just my own opinions, and I very easily could be wrong. So, yeah. All right, well, thank you guys very much for joining me. Hopefully, someday in the future, we can do this again. Hopefully, things will go a little bit smoother in the future. I hope you guys watching enjoyed this chat. I'm going to be doing this at the beginning of every month, focusing on a story, whether it's a movie or a book, first from the reader perspective and then from a author perspective, and hopefully I'll be able to keep getting people on to help balance out my perspective, because these are some amazing views. So in closing, I hope you guys will check out all these women, the links, read their books. They're amazing. Check out PFW. I'm going to put everything below. And then for me this month, definitely go check out the website. I'm going to have some cool things coming. On the 23rd, the second episode of season 2 of the Raven Tree Society is coming out. So if you haven't read anything yet, this is a great time to go catch up. This particular episode was very scary for me to put out, and so far feedback has been great, so I'm excited about it. But I also have some other fun things. You've probably seen me drinking out of this. I have a new line of merch coming, and this is the very first. So this is the logo for the Raven Tree Society. So I'm just trying it out right now in this mug, but hopefully I will have merch out soon so you guys can purchase it. And I have new ideas for other merch I can do for Tahiri and for Malfunction and for other things yet to come. So definitely go check these things out. So girls, you want to fill everyone in on what you're doing this month, Bethany?
Yeah, this month I'm publishing my third, yes, short story in the Firstborn's Legacy Steward Saga, or Steward, not Steward Saga, Steward Stories. It's called, I'm getting everything mixed up right now in my head. It's called Aurelia the Nightwalker. I'm very excited for it. There's a talking raccoon, which is really fun. It comes out, I believe, also on the 23rd. Yeah, so you can keep a lookout for that. It will be available on Amazon, and also it'll be for free for my newsletter subscribers.
And where can they find you? I know I'm going to put the links below, but just let them reminded where they can go.
Yeah, my website is bethwangler.com. Wangler is Wangler. And then I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Beth_Wangler, and on Facebook as Beth Wangler.
Beth?
Yay. Yeah, I have a week from today, so March 16th, Gifted is coming out, officially published, which I'm very excited about. I've waited a very long time for this one. So it's a superhero fantasy short story. So it'll come out March 16th, so you can look for that on Amazon. And otherwise, you can find me at ebdawsonwriting.com is my website, and on Twitter I am at ebdawsonwriting. And yeah, I think Instagram and Facebook it's ebdawson writing. You can find me. They're linked.
All right, thanks so much, girls. And we'll chat next time.